Hello everyone, this is the second of 3 lectures that discusses qualitative research. Alright, so the main focus of what we're going to be doing here is how would one actually put together and design a qualitative research study. So I'll start off here by talking a little bit about different types of data that one can use in a qualitative research study. The first is probably what we typically think of, and that is interviews, and that's actually going to be the focus of most of this lecture. But there are a number of different strategies that one can use. We can also use focus groups. You've probably seen work that's done that. You can also do qualitative surveys. Often when we think of surveys, we're only thinking about quantitative surveys where we actually get numbers out of people's responses. But you can also ask an open-ended question where people can write their thoughts on a particular question. Another approach is field observations. So that's a situation where someone might go into a specific context and just observe what's going on around them and write down their notes about their experiences. Another thing that is often done is looking at historical records. So this can give you data about how people are thinking about a specific question and a window into understanding the evolution of a culture, for example. One can also get secondary data, so that would be data from other people's studies that allow you to address this question. And another approach that's sometimes used is actually to look at media files, so songs or video or other types of sources to get a better insight into a specific community. So let's talk a little bit more about interviews. Well, there's a few different kinds. One would be a structured interview. Now, a structured interview is really where all the questions that are asked are exactly laid out word for word. And this is often done on phone surveys. So the person doing the phone survey sometimes doesn't even know much about the research at all. They're just reading off a script. So this is a situation where there really wouldn't be any conversation at all between people involved. A more common structure for qualitative research is what's called a semi-structured interview. This is a situation where the researcher has come up with ideas about different things that they want to ask to interrogate about a certain experience or type of question. And they've come up with general questions which they will then ask during the interview, and they'll go back and forth between the interviewer and the interviewee and discuss a specific question to sort of gain insight into what it means. But it will have clear ideas about what should be addressed in that interview. Another format is an unstructured interview, and this is an approach that's sometimes used when a researcher just wants to talk to and understand a certain group of people and allow them to really tell them what they think about a topic area, and not to really come into it with any initial ideas about what that conversation should look like. Other approaches are group interviews. So sometimes it's helpful to talk to people all at once. And a specific type of this format is focus group discussions. There's different ways of doing this. Sometimes you have it led by the interviewer. Sometimes you have it done such that you really just have certain questions there and you let the group address it in their own fashion. So depending on the type of approach, you get very different types of data. So how does qualitative research get implemented? In the example of a semi-structured interview format, one would select a topic and decide on who you're going to be talking to and have as a sample. You'd then develop an interview field guide, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. You'd then collect the data, analyze the data, the written transcripts of the conversation you've had, and then check the findings that you come up with. So you come up with some conclusions from it, and you would go back to the participants to find out more about whether you accurately described their experiences. All right. So what is the first step? Well, we've already talked a fair bit about the very first step, which is trying to figure out what is actually the most interesting question, the question that would be most helpful to the population that you're looking at, or that addresses a specific gap in the literature. So in the context of what you're looking at, you will really need to think about who you want to talk to answer that question. And there's a few different ways of doing this. One is convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is really focused in on really just finding the participants that are easiest for you to find. So, for example, if I were to do this, I'm sitting in my office right now, I could walk out into the hall, and if I want to know about students' experiences here at UWB, I just grab people as they walk by and interview them. So that's an example of a convenience sampling approach. Then there's purposeful sampling. So this is a situation where you're really seeking to find people for your sample who represent different types of experiences or different views on the question that you're addressing. So if the question is, how do people use blood glucose monitors, and how do they experience having to use that? Well, you can focus in on addressing patients who are using blood glucose monitors, and that would be a subset of your sample. But you also might want to interview healthcare workers, and you might want to interview their family members, for example, to get a broader idea of how this is actually happening in practice. Finally, another approach that's used sometimes is called snowball sampling. So this is a situation where you have a certain group of people that are relevant to what you want to study, sometimes that are difficult to access. So you can use this in a wide range of different approaches. It doesn't have to be a population that's hard to access, but you would very often use it in a situation where, say, someone was involved in illegal activity. So if you want to talk to injection drug users, very often it's hard to just go out and put up a sign and be like, hey, do you inject heroin? Do you want to come and talk to us about your experience? Typically, this population probably would not be willing to talk to you and wouldn't come in to be interviewed. However, if you're able to find one person who will talk to you, you can ask them to refer you to other potential participants. So it's a way of them connecting, or actually typically they'll refer other participants to you. It's a way of connecting to people's social networks to get more information about a specific question. And again, it's typically used in stigmatized groups. So one of the most important questions for qualitative research is what's called data saturation. So this is really the idea that as you're asking people questions, in interview context, eventually you're going to start, as you interview more and more people, you're going to start hearing the same themes come up. Now, data saturation is not when you actually are able to start identifying themes. Saturation is when you start to no longer hear new themes come up. So let me give you an example of this. So if I were to ask this class, what are the major stressors for you as an RN to BSN student? Well, I would go from one person to another, and you start to get some answers along the lines of probably familial obligations, lack of time, workload. Now, if I were to do this individually with each of you, I would start noticing these themes. But what would probably happen is after I interview, say, 20 or 30 of you, these themes would probably be pretty similar. I wouldn't be hearing much more new information about your thoughts on this question. Now, there is a fact that you will always get some new information every time you talk to someone, but increasingly it will stop being new information that really represents a theme of people's experience. So if I interview 833 students and number 532 says, well, I'm stressed because I don't get to watch enough Star Trek, that will be sort of an outlier. It probably wouldn't make its way to be a theme. So the point here is that you actually often don't even need to interview a huge number of people before you start seeing those themes evolve. Now, saturation is important as it relates to questions. So some qualitative research questions aren't very good because you'll never really be able to get saturation. So if I was to ask a question along the lines of what makes life meaningful to you, and I was to ask that to everybody in this room, you wouldn't really get saturation because that's such a complicated open question that you might be able to get some sort of themes out of interviewing 10,000 people, but you can't really interview 10,000 people. So it's just too broad of a question to really get meaningful results for. If you compare that to, say, a more narrow question like how do you experience having a child who suddenly loses their hearing, then you have a more distinct scope to that question. Now, the more narrow your focus, often the smaller the number of people you will have to interview to get saturation in your data. So it can, in theory, be possible to interview, say, 10 people and still get saturation in your data if it's a narrow enough question and familiar enough to that group of people such that you start seeing exactly the same responses from people as you interview more and more. So another key element to qualitative research is the concept of bracketing. Bracketing is really the idea that everybody is biased. When you're doing a study like this, you're typically coming at it from some perspective, some opinion. You wouldn't typically study something that you don't care about at all. If you care about something and have ideas about it already, there's a possibility that your biases may come into your study and affect how you interpret what people are saying to you. So this is a really big issue for potentially producing qualitative research because you could not accurately represent people's opinions. So the idea of bracketing is the idea that one should, when one is entering a study, should identify your pre-existing beliefs and attempt to set them aside. So this is a process called bracketing. So you write down a list of all things that you think is your biases, and you try and, when you're paying attention to somebody and listening to their interview, that you're trying not to impose your pre-existing beliefs on what they're telling you. So when you're preparing to do qualitative research, one of the major steps that is typically used, but not always used, is to develop a field guide. The field guide really tries to outline the issues that are going to be explored in the study, and in doing so, tries to process it so that you can actually come up with specific questions that you want to address in your conversations with people. So these questions should actually be presented in a way that it's easy to access, that it can flow in a conversation. And they should also really be open-ended questions so that a person can answer them fluidly. So if you have a question that really allows someone to say yes or no, and that's their only answer, that is actually not a very effective way of gaining rich data. So you have to ask questions that really encourage people to share their ideas and thoughts. The other thing about questions is that they should really be neutral. So you don't want them to be leading or sound biased so that the person that you're interviewing thinks that they have to answer in a certain way to make you happy. So the field guide really is something that you can use during an interview to make sure that you're addressing all the topics that you want to discuss during this interview. All right, so these are some initial steps that one would take in designing a qualitative research study. In the next section, the third and final section, we'll talk a little bit about how you actually carry out a qualitative research study.